my pain, numb my heart, and ease my brain. Oh, whiskey, don't you...
Why think alone when you can drink it all in with Ricochet's 3 Whiskey Happy Hour? Join your bartenders, Steve Hayward, John Yu, and the international woman of mystery, Lucretia.
Well, this life that I've been living ain't too easy on the soul. Sometimes you gotta give in and let that whiskey...
Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to this first of the revived classic format editions of the podcast, in which I have long-form conversations and interviews with authors and other interesting people, and fitting for the 3 Whiskey Happy Hour podcast, that our first guest in the revived series is someone who not only traces his ancestry back to Ireland, but who spends a lot of his time in Ireland living today. And that person is Michael Walsh, whose most recent book is called A Rage to Conquer, 12 Battles That Changed the Course of Western History. But before I get into it with Michael, you should know that he is a true Renaissance man. He's written over 20 books, worked as a senior foreign correspondent for Time magazine for almost 20 years. He has written classical music and made many classical performances, and his books range from novels to books about classical music and modern opera, and books about things like the insidious effect of the Frankfurt School. And now this book that we're talking about today is the second of a projected 3 volumes that talk about the glories of warfare. And by that he means that, modern sensibilities are all against war and fighting. And of course, he recognizes it as a trait of human nature, a necessity that should be grasped with relish rather than with the fashionable dread of modern times. His first book in the series was called Last Stands, Why Men Fight When All Is Lost. And the current one, as I say, is A Rage to Conquer. And so let's get into it with Michael, and I think you will find this conversation fascinating. Well, Michael, this is your 19th book by my count, A Rage to Conquer, 12 Battles That Changed the Course of American History. And I haven't read all your books. I've read, I don't know, a quarter of them maybe, but this is my favorite so far. I just had a delight reading through it. And I'm actually not through the whole thing, but every chapter I'm having great fun. So it's a sequel to Last Stands. I want to come back to the Last Stands book later, actually, and get straight into this book. So 12 battles, but it's wrapped inside a thesis, which is you're rehabilitating war. I remember graffiti on a bomb from the first Gulf War in 1991 that said, "Give war a chance."
Yes.
Which, a nice play on that stupid old John Lennon lyric, I think it was.
Make war great again.
Make war great again. Well, and I think hopefully this isn't too much of a simplification to say your thesis is that war is normal, natural, praiseworthy, something to be admired and not abjured the way it is in modern times. Is that too crude a summary of what you're trying to get at here?
No, I think that's fair, Steve. I think what I'm trying to do, as I did in Last Stance with a quote from Immanuel Kant, was to point out war is the natural state of mankind and peace is the aberration. And so we live in this funny interwar period. It'll be seen as that later on. Of course, we don't notice it because we think, well, this is normal and we grew up in that. But, old codgers like you and I grew up, were born and raised right after the Second World War. And we've really lived through a time of extraordinarily a peaceful world comparative to World War II.
Right.
And I just think we have to face the fact that war is inevitable. And the most important takeaway I have is that war is not a failure. I think that we've come to this notion, I think, post-World War II, especially with the UN, that war can somehow be preempted or avoided. And it represents a misinterpretation of Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is policy by other means. And as I go to some length to point out, what he actually said is war is policy with other means. The German word is very clear. I don't know why it's been so consistently mistranslated. But if you say by, to me, it sounds like, well, everything else has failed, so now we're using other means. Whereas properly understood, warfare is a tool in the diplomatic kit to be used when necessary. It's the axe behind the glass, basically. but when you need it, you use it. So that's really the thesis behind all the discussions in Rage to Conquer.
Yeah, it reminds me of a professor I had in graduate school now more than 40 years ago, who, before going into academia, had been a tank driver for Patton's Third Army in World War II. And he had an ingenious way of starting his class on diplomacy and military power that you'll appreciate. He would, on the first day of class, pass around a World War II M1 rifle and
Mm.
explained how it worked. And then he'd fix the bayonet, describe how to use the bayonet when you're out of ammunition. And he was very lyrical about it. And then he would end by saying, holding up the gun and say, "This is the basic tool of diplomacy. Next class, we'll start talking about the basic tools of military power."
Mhm.
So that was very much your understanding of Klaus, what you're just explaining. And they don't make professors like that anymore, needless to say. And
No.
so I'm hearing echoes of certain. The other person you remind me of a bit was, well, maybe I'm jumping ahead too far, but your last chapter about the post 9/11 world and how unserious we've been about things. And you
Yes.
remind me of my late friend who you may have known was Angelo Codavia.
Oh, very well.
Right. Yeah. Angelo used to say, I'm not sure he ever wrote it anywhere, but he used to say, as you point out in your chapter, the Saudis were up to their necks in what was going on behind 9/11. I think
Marvelous.
we know that's the concealed part of the 9/11 Commission report. And he said, a lot of those royal family people live in those high-rise luxury hotels. We just ought to round up 3,000 of them and execute them as,
Mhm.
right, as retribution for what they connived in. And okay. Anyway, the point is this is a real breath of fresh air when so much treatment of warfare and conflict, as you say, is sort of, I put it, sentimental Kantianism. All right. Anyway, that's my commentary on your very sound commentary. We're in heated agreement about all this, I think.
Good.
Let's take a look at some of the battles. You pick a lot from antiquity, Achilles, Alexander, Caesar, Constantine. And I guess uh, maybe the way to unpack this is to say a lot of those are a long time ago and remote from modern history. And although they were important to ancient history, it seems to me the presumption there is that the Western history is one long continuity, and that without those, we wouldn't be where we are today, which I think would be a novel proposition to a lot of people who think that's just antiquity and has no relevance to our world today.
Yeah, well, they're almost as old as the Constitution, Steve.
Right. I love that. Right.
I
Yes.
forget which idiot said that, but
Ezra Klein. It was Ezra Klein. The
oh,
Constitution's like 100 years old, he
like
said. Yeah.
100 years old, and
Right.
what relevance could it possibly have to us?
Right.
Well, I was thinking about this last November. I was actually in the Forum in Rome, which is like old, right? Old. And I was walking the footsteps of Caesar, and it doesn't seem that old when you're actually in it. And I think that's the point. Is
Yeah.
especially as Americans, we're disassociated from our own originations and our own pasts and our own people's past to some extent. We have a new covenant, as it were, a new beginning, a new hope. But we go back to Greco-Romanism, and I've made the distinction in this book, and I will make it even more in the third book in this series, which I'm writing right now, that I believe that we are a Greco-Roman civilization, not a Judeo-Christian civilization, for many, 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 many reasons. But as far as our Western civilization starts, it starts with the Iliad. And it starts with Homer. Now, that is roughly contemporaneous with the origins of Judaism, as you know. So the Trojan War takes place about 1200 BC. So do the early stages of Judaism and Moses and the Egyptian captivity, etc. Homer writes in 800 BC, which is right around the time that Judaism is coming together as a Mosaic faith. Augustus becomes emperor right around the time that Jesus is born and Christianity is born and rabbinic Judaism is begun. So these religions and histories bump into each other constantly. But from my own point of view, and this is not to argue religion, I'll do that in the next book, but I've got to leave the folks wanting more. From a historical point of view and from a literary, cultural, military point of view, we really start with the Greco-Roman period. So that's why I began with the Iliad and with Alexander the Great.
Yeah, okay. Um, and then you one chapter that goes into a period that I have to confess I'm weak on was the Crusades. It's your chapter 7.
Yes.
What is it? Bohemond et Dorylaeum. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm not. I was not surprised, but still nonetheless delighted to see you rehabilitate the Crusades from all the calumny thrown at that episode in Western history. But then from there, you jump up to Napoleon. And I'm thinking, is there a reason you skipped some of the battles in between? Or maybe it was in your last book and I just don't remember it. I'm thinking, if the Polish cavalry doesn't show up at the Battle of Lepanto, more of Europe would be Islamic hundreds of years ago, as opposed to only
Correct.
half as a quarter Islamic today. We'll come back to
Yes.
that. Anyway, so what were your criteria for picking these battles and excluding certain other ones that might be?
Well, some of them I had done. So people said, "Oh, well, you forgot X, Y, and Z." I said, "Well, it was
Yeah.
in Last Dance." And some
Okay.
I'm going to do in the new book, which is called The Wrath of God, and it's explicitly about religious warfare. So the whole Muslim Christian series of conflicts. Well, I'm going to begin with the Hebrews and the Canaanites in the first book of the Torah, and continue forward again to 9/11 and the current very long war we're fighting against Islam, even though only one side seems to think that it's a war,
Right.
which is a problem. So that's why. Also, I wanted to get the notion of heroic individual commanders front and center in each one of these battles. That's why it's Alexander, it's Caesar, it's Constantine. It's a guy nobody's ever heard of called Aetius, who stood off Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. And by the time I was getting past those origin stories, I thought Napoleon was the next person to do. He just is more so than Wellington in a way. And remember that Napoleon and Wellington never fought each other until the very last battle, which was Waterloo. Napoleon dominated the 19th century in a way that very few men have dominated a century. And that's a century filled with dominant male personalities. So I just was irresistibly drawn to Napoleon, partly for his tactics on the battlefield, but mostly because he represents the artist as hero. Forget that he's a military commander. He is a self-made man of relatively low origins. He's an Italian, for one thing, who is French by pure accident of a treaty. He never even learns to speak French very well. His men made fun of him all the time. His accent was apparently terrible. And yet, by dint of sheer personality, he wins the Battle of Austerlitz because he knows Alexander and Caesar. He's studied them very carefully. And in each one of the battles in Rage to Conquer, not each one, but in many, you will see the commander goes, "Oh, yeah, Caesar was in this exact same position. And what did he do to get out of it? Well, that's what I'm going to do." And so you see this constant repetition of battlefield tactics and maneuvering, and strategic maneuvering, even more important, that echoes down through the ages. So that's why I made that big leap to Napoleon, and then we move into the World War II commanders on the Battle of 9/11.
Well, right, yes. I mean, Patton's invocation of Caesar and leaders of military leaders of antiquity is legendary from the movie, if nothing else.
Yes, but
And
it's true.
yeah, we also mentioned Nimitz at Midway,
Yeah.
Pershing at Hell. Yeah, I can't say French myself worth a darn. I'm worse than Napoleon, but
You're worse than Napoleon.
yeah, that's right. In a war that, yeah, I mean, World War I is a war known for its lack of maneuver for reasons I'll come back to that I think maybe are of lingering importance. But um, yeah, but I mean, the other one, did anyone bring up to you, and again, forgive me if I missed it in the previous book, you skipped the Civil War battles, or the Civil War itself, which seems to me was quite pivotal, not just to America, but I think for the world, actually.
Yeah,
is
well,
my
I
view, but-
I did Shiloh in Last Dance.
Okay.
And the reason I did Shiloh and not Gettysburg or Antietam or Vicksburg was that if Grant had lost at the end of day one of Shiloh, the war was over. Over. He's gone. Sherman's gone. The Union Army has been defeated and sent packing. The Confederates command the Tennessee River and the Mississippi River because you don't have Grant to come take Vicksburg later on. The whole war effort collapses right there up against the banks of the Tennessee River. And when I did that chapter, I got in the car and I drove myself from New England to Shiloh, actually, to walk that battlefield. And when you get to the part where they're right at the river, this is the end of day one, they've been surprise attacked. Sherman has blown off the reports that there's this giant Confederate army right out there behind the trees. Grant's up the river recuperating from a riding accident, and he was the best horseman in the army, and his horse had slipped in the mud and landed on his leg. So he was recuperating from that. If they were to have been pushed into the river on day one, that was the end of it. So that's why I let that stand in for the Civil War, for this current project.
Right. So let me ask you a combination question that explains, or it gives reason why the rage to conquer, as you put it, is not respected, not acknowledged, not understood, not encouraged today. And that would be the argument that I think Churchill makes the best of anybody starting around 1901, that modern warfare was going to be different, right? That famous early speech he gives, I think in 1901, where he says the wars of peoples will be worse than the wars of kings. Why? Mm-hmm. Because of technology. We're now going to have, total war, as we later called it, in which civilian casualties and civilian damage would be much greater than it had ever been before. And then you combine that with technology, and one of his later essays, I think it was Mass Effects in Modern Life, he says, I'll paraphrase, the problem with modern warfare is there's no, or there's much less scope for battlefield heroism. The generals who used to be on their horse, like Napoleon, like Marlborough, like Grant and Lee, they're now remote from the battlefield. And so they're not as decisive as they once would have been, in those older battles. And, and so in other words, the nature of modern warfare has changed. It has lost its, I guess I might say, its manliness in some ways. And so, I mean, how do you regard that argument? And do you credit that with being a factor in why sort of mass opinion has turned so against war, or regards it the way it does?
Well, let me start by uttering a complete heresy.
I was afraid you were going to do that. Go ahead.
I'm not a Churchill fan.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
I am not a Churchill fan. I am not a Churchill fan. And the reason I am not a Churchill fan has to do with that exact attitude. Remember that Churchill fought with Kitchener in the assault on the Mahdi was already dead. He had killed Gordon, and then he died, and then there was the Battle of Omdurman. And Churchill was a young officer, and he wrote famously, "There's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at and missed." Okay, so you got shot at and missed. After that, his military judgment is horrendously terrible. He's the architect of Gallipoli, for one thing, which was blatant stupidity. He was the architect of the soft underbelly theory that got Americans killed at Anzio and didn't work anyway. At no point is he a great strategic military thinker. He has lots of great qualities, and we're not going to get into an argument with Larry Arnn about Churchill, or you for that matter.
Right.
But I don't think he's a great military mind. And I think he presided over the dissolution of the empire. I mean, he has a lot of negatives in his column that the Churchill fan club seems to ignore. But I think, his experience was riding that horse and getting shot at by some Arabs that couldn't shoot straight. And therefore, he wonders about that. But Patton gives the lie to that. Patton gets shot in World War I. His orderly he's right in the front. He and MacArthur wandering around in costume saying, "Kill us," right? And Patton gets shot in the butt and has to be dragged into a shell hole and then brought back. He was always at the front. And so I quoted John Keegan at the beginning of this book about great commanders, which is in front, always, sometimes, never. Okay, you can still have a great commander who's never at the front. Nimitz is a good example of that. Nimitz fought the Battle of Midway from Honolulu, where I grew up, Pearl Harbor, as a matter of fact. When I grew up and I was going to high school, I'd walk out my front door and see Pearl Harbor. It was right there
Mm.
in front of me. So I lived with that as a young teenager. But Nimitz won that war uh, because he understood the enemy, and he had a sense of tactical innovation. His great genius was, hey, we're a little short on aircraft carriers, but hey, that Midway Island, that's an aircraft carrier. It just doesn't go anywhere. So what we'll do is hide our other aircraft carriers behind it, and the Japanese will sail right into the trap. And that's what happened. And we put four of their carriers at the bottom. And that really broke the offensive power of the Imperial Navy. The war's over at that point, but the mopping up campaign, don't get me started on Douglas MacArthur. The mopping up campaign also obviously follows that. So I think that's only partly true. I think Alexander wore a plumed helmet. Kill me. Caesar wore a red coat. Here I am. Come and get. You want a piece of me? I'm right here. And and Napoleon did too. And their men loved them. What we have is a bunch of political generals, plush-bottomed fruit salads, who have never done a goddamn thing and have risen in the peacetime professional army. I'm also against the all volunteer army. I think it's very bad. I think it's bad for the country. I think it's bad for young men. I think it's bad for women. I think it's bad for everybody. And the results, well, tell me the last war we won.
Yeah, right. No, I think I agree with you about that. I sometimes have friendly expressions about the idea of national service, which would be mostly military service. It's a big problem. I don't want to argue about Churchill either, except I do want to say, Michael, that I wonder if some of that isn't your inner Irishman coming out a bit.
Well, actually, seriously, it's not, because after all, Churchill was half American. So,
right.
Uh,
Right. Or as his critics said, half American and wholly reprehensible.
Oh, well, yeah. Or as I wrote in my novel on All the Saints about Fiorello LaGuardia, half Italian, half Jewish, and neither half the good half, basically.
Right. Well, I do think there's something to his argument, though, about push button warfare, which we have now. I mean,
Yes,
I know you have strong views about, which I have a lot of sympathy with. I think about the Russian-Ukraine war going on, but it's hard to see coming out of that there's going to be a commander or a military figure and tales of heroism and turning points. It looks like a grinded out technological war of who can bring the most killing capacity from our modern machinery, and who wants to sign up for that.
Well, that's true. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Anne. Her name will lose me at the moment. It's called Nuclear War. And it is a scenario. It's relatively recent. It's riveting. I recommend it to everybody. What would happen in the event of a nuclear war? And the answer is we're all going to die. That's it. So there is no battlefield tactics to nuclear war. Much of it is going to be controlled by AI, actually.
Right.
So the robots will end up killing us. After they steal our livelihood, they'll kill us. But what's lacking isn't so much battlefield exposure. It's just plain leadership. You haven't had a leader among military for my lifetime, basically. I mean, I remember very vaguely, I think, or maybe it's in my childhood, MacArthur's farewell speech after Truman fired him.
Right.
And what figure has there been, even though I think MacArthur's vastly overrated, what figure has there been of that national stature who was a military person?
Well, I mean, would you count de Gaulle and Eisenhower, who were still figures of my youth?
Yes.
Well, I was sort of born late Eisenhower years, but de Gaulle came back in the '60s, and I mean, I always point to him as someone who was, in many ways, a repulsive human being, and also very able, and I think, and indispensable in some ways, and a figure more Americans ought to study. That's what I say.
Oh, well, I think Eisenhower was a great general. He was a great bureaucrat general. He didn't fight. In fact, of all the guys in World War II who had been World War I veterans, Eisenhower wasn't one of them. He stayed in the United States the whole time. But what he was a guy who could move his chess pieces. So there's no doubt that Patton is one of the greatest battlefield commanders we ever had. But you couldn't let Patton run the whole thing because it would spin off the rails, and you needed to unleash that dog of war only when necessary. Marshall was very similar. Marshall wanted a command, but very early on, the Army had realized this guy is an organizing genius. So why do we want to get him killed off as a first lieutenant or a captain when we can, stash him at Fort Belvoir in Washington and learn the bureaucracy? It's important to remember, I think, Steve, for our audiences, we didn't have a professional.
Yeah. Let me stop you, Michael. You froze up on me for about 20 seconds there, and where you left off was maybe it was my end. But let me have you restart. The sentence you were in the middle of was Marshall was an organizing genius, and before that we're talking about Eisenhower and so forth. So pick up again with General Marshall, and just start from the beginning of that, and I'll splice it together.
Sure. Marshall was an organizing genius, so it didn't make any sense for them to send him to war and get him killed off as a first lieutenant or a captain when they could stash him at Fort Belvoir in Washington and teach him the organizational principles of the Army. So it's important to remember that we didn't have a professional army. We didn't have one at the time of the Civil War. We didn't have one in World War I. We didn't have one in World War II. We started from scratch in every one of those wars. Remember that Grant had been a graduate of West Point and had served and had resigned his commission and gone off. He was lonely. He was stationed out in Nowheresville, California, in the Oregon territories, and he was lonely and homesick, and he missed his wife. So he drank too much when he was off duty. He was never on duty drunk. So he quit. And at the time of the Civil War, he was working and failing in a little tanner shop in Galena that I think his father owned, or one of his relatives. And he said, "Hey, I've got a captaincy in the Army, or I'm actually a professional soldier." So they gave him a command immediately, and then he made his bones rather quickly after that. But we had to start World War I from a standing start. General Pershing, who is the hero of the World War I section in my final big chapter, he had been a career Army officer, but he was like at the what's the name of that place in San Francisco? The
Presidio?
Yeah, the Presidio. He had been stationed there. He had also commanded a troop of black soldiers in Southwest, which gave him his nickname of Black Jack. That's where that came from. He was the white officer in charge of an all-black unit. And as a result, so when World War I comes, Pershing is the most senior figure, and it's up to him to suddenly organize an army out of nothing, out of Iowa farm boys, basically. And then we got caught with our pants down again in World War II and had to mobilize. Now, luckily, America in those days was capable of doing such a thing. And we could turn civilian production, like Henry Ford's automobile assembly line, into making tanks and trucks. So we were able to do that. But the standing professional army was something the founders warned against, and no one really thought that was a good idea because that was a tool of tyranny. And that's why you have the Third Amendment, for example, that the Army can't come to your house in California and say, "Here, we're putting a platoon of soldiers in your den. Have a nice day."
Right. Yeah. Right. So let's go to your last chapter on the post 9/11 world we're in the middle of. And when I say it's a splendid, contemptuous rant, I meant that as praise, not as criticism. Let me share with, I'm not even quite sure how I can characterize it. So let me share one sentence with our listeners. It's from page 371. Quote, "The Imperial Romans would have gone full delenda est on Saudi Arabia, razed its cities, destroyed the Kaaba, leveled the mosques, occupied the oil fields, seized its wealth, executed its leaders, and sold the populace into slavery. They knew an existential struggle when they were in one." So, I mean, that's one that blows your hair back, and but
that's the money sentence in the book. Everyone picked up on
really?
That. Yeah.
Okay, good. Right. No, I mean, you explained sort of the incompetence and the sort of willful blindness to what really is going on. And And by the way, that feeds into, I agree with you completely about we have political generals who are promoted not for military excellence, but for bureaucratic role playing. And it's very, very bad. I don't know if you want to add to all that. I mean, that is your money sentence, but
Well, I do have this to say. We do have political generals, and people don't realize that, for example, with general, the rank of general, there's gradations of it, and you get the first two from your service. So you get promoted to brigadier general and you get promoted to major general. Lieutenant general, which is 3 stars, you get from politicians, and then 4 stars, and then there's only been a handful of 5 stars in the history of the country. So, and oftentimes offices are created that require 3 stars. So the head of the National Security Agency, for example, must be a 3 star. So if you're up for that job, you're going to get promoted to a 3 star, and then you're going to be the head of the National Security Agency. There are a number of positions in which that is a requirement. So, in the bureaucratizing monster that is the U.S. government, we create roles and then fill them. That doesn't mean we have more generals or more top generals, and it doesn't mean any of them have had any military in the field experience except accidentally. It just means more generals. That's what it
right.
means.
Yeah, right. Last question on military subjects, and then I want to change to Ireland for a few minutes. I have seen you tweet out here and there and make other brief comments that all seem to point in the direction of thinking we are overestimating China as a military threat to us.
Yes.
And so say a little bit more, and you did mention that, I think, here in your last chapter of the book. And I gather it's not that they're not building lots of ships and planes and rockets that are bad things, but that they're actually not very capable as a war-fighting civilization. Is that fair enough? Or how do
Well,
you?
I think history shows that. So name a war they've won against a Western power. The answer is zero. They took on the Arabs in the 8th century at a battle called Talas, Talas. And it was mixed army of Chinese and other Asians against the expanding caliphate. And the Chinese were trying to push westward. They ran into the Arabs and they got whopped. And one of the reasons they got whopped is in Chinese culture, a military career wasn't honorable. It wasn't something to be, remember, that is a giant bureaucratic hive. And military people didn't rise to the top. So their generals were Koreans. And now I can speak with some familial interest in this, since my father is a veteran of the Chosin Reservoir battle that the Marines fought against the Chinese. He's one of the last survivors. He's 99 years old.
Wow.
And he was in the whole Korean campaign from Pusan to Incheon to Seoul to the Chosin Reservoir to the extraction. And people sometimes bring that up and say, well, the Chinese really put a hurt on the Marines. Well, it helps if you have 10-to-1 numerical superiority and you attack in a surprise attack, and it's 30 below zero and you have overwhelming manpower. And what the Marines did is, it's considered a glorious battle in Marine history, is they withstood that assault, maintained unit cohesion, and took everybody home, basically, that could get there. I think he must have weighed 120 pounds by the time he landed after they came back. So China doesn't have a great track record. They can fight civil wars. Then their civil wars are astoundingly bloody. But as I like to point out, General Gordon beat them with a swagger stick. That's why he was called Chinese Gordon.
Chinese Gordon, right.
Before he got killed at Khartoum. The Japanese beat them twice in the 1930s with a platoon of katana swordsmen and some sushi. I don't know what they did, but they beat China twice. So I don't think they're a good military power. I think they're building a lot of stuff, but we know the quality of what they build is bad. The Africans are finding out now that it's a Faustian bargain when you let them in to build dams that collapse and roads that don't work, and nothing works. And I also have been told by some people that much of the technology that they have stolen in order to produce their stuff is booby-trapped.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, we did a little of that with the Soviet Union way back once upon a
Yeah,
time.
so that if they
Right.
launch those ships, they're going right down to the bottom of the ocean.
Interesting. Yeah. I
So
mean,
I know a lot of our colleagues are obsessed with China, and Frank
yeah,
Gaffney and I have this argument all the time. I just have other things to worry about than the Chinese.
yeah, yeah, me too. Let's switch to Ireland a little bit because you not only are of Irish descent, but you live, what, half the year over there or some good portion of your time out in remind me where it is out in Western Ireland. You have a residence?
Yes, I rebuilt my great-grandmother's birthplace. Um,
Ah,
it's now a beautiful home where my wife lives much of the year, where my daughter met her husband and married him. He's a Dubliner, and where my three grandchildren come and play. Um,
right.
it's in a wild, wild part of the West called the Burren, which doesn't look like any other place in Ireland. It looks like the moon. It's all rocks. But right out my window are the cliffs of Moher, the three Aran Islands, the
Mm.
Atlantic Ocean, and Galway Bay, and the hills of Connemara. So someone once came over, looked out our dining room window, and said, there are six sites everybody comes to Ireland to see, and five of them are right out your window. Which
Right.
so I looked
Right.
into Grandma there, but
Right.
I went back and reunited the families 52 years ago, and since then acquired the property, built the houses, really established a whole life there now. In fact,
Right.
my late daughter is her ashes are buried there too. So it means a lot to me. So that it's not just that I'm some returned Yank who what thinks his family came from Cork, which is what they all say when you ask them, where did your family
Right.
come from? Cork. The reason they say that is that Cork is where the boats left from.
Ah, right. Yeah.
That's the way the Irish think, by the way.
Yeah.
It's a
Right.
kind of Celtic way of thinking. Specific that question means where did I literally come from to get to the United States? Cork is always the answer.
Right. So, I was in Ireland for almost 10 days about a month and a half ago,
Yeah,
and I happened to be in Dublin on a day when there was a large protest against immigration. I'm not quite sure who the umbrella group was, but and then there was the lefties organized a counter protest that was small and pathetic and
yeah,
communist. I mean, they were very open about it. But I have to say, I was impressed by the size of the protest. I mean, the march stretched for, I don't know, 10 or 15 blocks. I forget what that main street is. And that ended up in a rally in front of the customs house
yeah.
where the speakers, and I wasn't familiar with any of them, but I listened to their speeches and I thought they were all very good. These weren't crazy people. The crowd was very diverse. As as we're taught that we have to factor into things these days. And so I got the sense that there is not a lot of press coverage of Ireland in the American media, and you've got to work to find it in the British press or the Economist, which is no good, of course.
Yeah.
And then someone told me just this morning about a tweet that apparently is exploding on X, as we call it now, today as we're talking. And it goes something like this. I couldn't find it, but apparently it says something like, if you're an American visiting Ireland and you say, I'm Irish, they say, no, you're not. But if you're Somali, fresh off the boat 20 minutes ago, oh, of course you're an Irishman.
Right.
So this question, it seems to me, is splitting Ireland down the middle as it ought to, and as it is other places. What's your sense of the matter?
Okay.
Is it
It's
going to? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
it's complicated, but because it's Ireland, among the most disputatious people in the world. But it's very simple. Ireland is a slave state for 800 years. It has lived in a bubble. It has no experience of the outside world, except that it sent its sons and daughters abroad, where they became tremendously successful, wealthy, famous movie stars, captains of industry, titans of Hollywood, politicians, presidents of the United States. Ireland, nothing. And a certain resentment has grown up on both parts. That the returned Yanks come back and say, I'm Irish. And the Irish say, you are the son of a bitch who abandoned us to the famine. We hate you. You
Hmm.
left us in our hour of need. Whether they articulate that or not, that is the undercurrent. So they really hate the diaspora, people like me and a lot of my friends, and they have rushed because they're a slave state. Still, they're now a slave state of the what I like to call the EUSSR.
Yeah, it's good.
under Ilse She-Wolf of Brussels there, who, by the way, has never been elected to anything.
Yeah.
The Irish politicians have all sold out to Brussels. And so when people say, well, why aren't they helping the Irish people? I tell them that's not their job. Their job is to answer to Brussels. They don't care what happens to you. The population has increased by 1.5 million over a very short span of time. Most of them are not ethnic Irish, but to say ethnic Irish is to be a racist.
Mm.
The word they most fear is racism. So if you don't think that Somali, who, by the way, destroyed his passport on the plane, walked through customs waving, and was immediately given food, shelter, money, you name it, you're racist. My village happens to be the one that took the first wave of Ukrainian refugees. They put them in. We're a tourist town, and in the summer, the hotels were all filled with tourists. Now they're filled with Ukrainians, and they don't have to obey the laws. They don't have to register their cars. They get free money every week, and you see them lining up at the post office. And these are able-bodied draft dodgers. That's what they are. And there's no sugarcoating it. And they laugh at everybody because they're sitting there free. Yes, it's raining. The weather is terrible, famously so. But they're collecting free money, and they're going to do it for as long as they can get away with it. And as soon as they leave, you'll see an even greater influx from Africa, North Africa, Central Africa, Afghanistan. Romanian gypsies are now quite prominent in the criminal subculture of Dublin. We just have one now that it turns out the father is the head of the Roma Community Civil Rights League or something, and the son is running 8 brothels in Dublin. And the Irish are stunned by this because they have no experience with the world. They really believe all of the pablum that they have been fed about the goodness of man and the brotherhood of man, and we're all exactly the same. It's like being trapped in the 1960s in America there briefly. And you feel sorry for them because they're going to have to learn the hard way. But that government is never going to stop. It's never going to stop importing foreigners because the EU views Ireland as basically empty space, and it's a dumping ground for the EU's migration problems. So you can't walk to Ireland. So you got to come by boat or by plane. And they literally fly them in. The government advertised in Africa for people to get on planes and come to Ireland at government expense to stay and live forever.
Yeah, I mean, I should add that the protest I saw in the speeches, it wasn't just immigration; it was the European Union and Brussels. In fact, some of them said, paraphrase slightly, London's not our enemy anymore. Brussels is our enemy.
That's the point. That's the point. They're
right.
still obsessed with this stupid trouble stuff.
Yeah.
And as an Irish American, let me say this to all of our Jewish friends, and you and I have lots of Jewish friends. The anti-Semitism is a disgrace to Irishmen everywhere. What that government is doing, passing the Occupied Territories Bill, which amounts to a gnat on a water buffalo's rear end, nothing, but is pure virtue signaling. They are constantly slagging off the Israelis. Israel closed its embassy in Dublin because it couldn't take it anymore. And the Irish just see that's more proof of these perfidious Jews. Look what they're doing. You can't trust them. They're everywhere. They run it's a mass outbreak of insanity. And it is incredibly disgraceful. And I'm pleased to say there are a number of us diasporans with audiences and money and influence who are going to organize against this because we don't want to see Ireland go down the drain. It didn't suffer under the English terribly for 800 years, only to throw itself in the arms of Brussels,
Yeah.
It's like that line from Man for All Season. I can see selling your soul, but for Wales, basically. 800 years of fighting the British, who were a real worthy opponent, but for Brussels?
Yeah.
What, right. King Leopold? Who are we talking about here?
Right.
It's really stunning. I'm glad you had a good time. And some of Ireland, Dublin's never been a very nice city, and it's worse now. The rest of the country is great. It's beautiful
Yeah.
if you can take the weather. It's paradise, and I love every second that I'm there. But the government's anti-Semitism and its hatred of its own people is just unacceptable.
Yeah. So I have two exit questions for you. One about your next book, and then one about music and how they may connect together in a certain way. So you said that you're writing yet another, a sequel to this book and your last book. I guess it'll be
Yes.
book number 20. Tell us a little bit about what that book's going to be about, and maybe one or two things to look for.
Yeah, it's called The Wrath of God, and
Ah,
it's
yeah.
about the history of religious warfare. So when religions and peoples clash, so specifically uh, because of faith. So I mentioned the Exodus, for example, the foundation story of the Israelites in taking the land of Canaan at God's command, very violently, by the way. I'm going to treat the 30 Years' War, which, contrary to the notion that civilians never suffered in wars, the 30 Years' War reduced the population of Europe by about 50%. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody was free from that. And that was purely brand new faith, Lutheranism, taking on Catholicism. I treated the sack of Rome in the 16th century by the Lutherans and the Swiss guards saving the Pope and rushing him to the Castel San Angelo in Last Dance. But these, and of course, the ongoing battle between Islam and the United States. Our problem has always been in Bush, well, starting with both Bushes, but the notion that there's no state actor, so we have no one to punish. As I said, Caesar would have laughed at that. Yeah, I see one right there. And that's what he would have done. And we don't fight the enemy that has declared war on us because Islam doesn't have a pope. So any mufti can issue a fatwa that is like a federal judge, apparently, binding on the entire planet, right? Even though
Yeah.
the judge is in Honolulu.
Right.
So it's an asymmetric war that we haven't figured out how to fight yet, but we need to focus on it.
Yeah. Well, let me do a follow-up question on that because since your book came out, uh, well, I think somewhere in here, and I can't find it as I flip through the pages, I thought you said something about how we've never seriously struck at the sort of central node of this, which is Iran. Now, since your book was printed, we've had Israel have its 12-day war against Iran that culminated with Trump deciding, yeah, we will use these weapons we've been developing for 20 years to try and take out their main nuclear weapons development facility. How, what do you make of all that? It did not go far enough, but isn't that a sign at least somebody, at least Israel, is standing up for the West?
Well, Israel is standing up for the West, and I support the Israelis because they didn't start this fight, and that's
Right.
the point. Uh, it's so hard to make this point, but Islam fetishizes buildings. So if the Kaaba is gone and the well at Jam Quran is gone, Islam is gone. You can destroy St. Peter's Church, and the Pope will go live in Avignon. Catholicism cannot be destroyed by bombing, even setting Notre Dame on fire, which they did.
Right.
But Islam is focused on places. So the pilgrimage, the Hajj is very important. The Shia version is that down this well in Qum is hidden the 12th Imam who is waiting for it's an apocalyptic version. He will emerge at the time of complete chaos and convert the world to Islam. And that will be the end times. So the radical Christians have the same basic theology about end times and then Jesus appearing, and that's the end of the movie. But we won't go after their buildings because that's not who we are. And that's giving up the fight before you even have the fight. That's the
Right.
problem. Now,
Right.
if Islam promises to stay like a good enemy behind its own borders, we don't have a particular problem with them, and the Europeans have learned how to deal with that since stopping them at Vienna in the 17th century. But you can't have constant incursions and provocations. And that was why I made the point about what Romans would do. Because
Right.
Rome didn't last for 2,000 years for nothing. It had a will to survive in a way that no other major civilization has ever had. And it took action when it felt it needed. And is that kind of an apologist for Rome? Yeah, absolutely it is. I think Roman civilization was great, and we owe
Yeah.
our existence to it.
Well, I do like seeing the sort of comeback of the Roman Empire among especially young men these days that you hear about.
Oh, I think that's
Right.
the best meme ever. Yeah, he's probably thinking about other women. No, he's thinking about the Roman Empire.
Right.
Well, I
Right.
think young men need that, and I
Yes.
think this book I've written part for young men. Again, I grew up in the Marine Corps. I was born on a major Marine Corps base, and I was the son of a guy who had just come back from Korea, highly decorated Marine officer. So that was the tradition in which I grew up, and it wasn't militarized. And my father, I don't even know what his politics are. I literally don't. But what he inculcated in me and my brother and my three sisters is discipline. I asked him once, were you afraid when the Chinese came down the hill on the day after Thanksgiving and attacked? And he said, first of all, I thought he was going to hit me. Even though he's 99, I still stay well back from him because that left hook is a killer. He said, we went to work. And I finally understood what that meant years later, which is we're trained to do this. And the way Marines are trained is here's your training. If you're in trouble, observe your training. If you abandon your training, you're dead. If you observe your training, you have a chance to get out alive. So what they did was they immediately formed into their jobs. He commanded mortar platoons and began saturating the fields between the Chinese and the Marines to keep them backed off. And nobody panicked, and they all picked up and tried to get out of the pickle they were in. So it's all about military background. It's not about killing people. It's about discipline and getting your work done. I wouldn't have written 20. Well, this is going to be 20, and then there's 21, and then there's 22. So they're all in the planning stage. It's just discipline that gets it done. You can't chop down the tree with one blow, and you can't hit a 5-run homer. You have to do it every single day.
Right. Yeah. So last question comes in two parts, and I call it the other side of Michael Walsh. You have serious formal training in music.
Yes.
I think I've noticed the influence of that in your writing. I think in particular of your couple of books on the Frankfurt School, which gets much more at the cultural aspects of that whole thing and whole influence than the political philosophy parts that narrow people like me think of. And so the first part of the question is am I right in saying that there's an essential connection with the way you perceive certain things with your musical training? And part two is you're a serious composer. And maybe say just a little bit about, I think you're working on a piece, or maybe you've done a piece you're performing in Europe recently. So anyway, to take both parts of those, if you would. And
Yeah. Okay. Well, I went to the Eastman School of Music, among whose graduates is the late Chuck Mangione, who just died yesterday, I guess. I knew Chuck a little bit. He was about 10 years ahead of me, I think, at Eastman. Renee Fleming, the great opera soprano, is a friend of mine. She's also a graduate of the Eastman School of Music. I'm not a composer anymore. I was in college, but that was not my calling. But I did it, and I learned a lot from it as a writer. So I'll be playing a program of mostly Franz Liszt at the Brand Library in Glendale. It will also consist of a very rarely performed sonata by Wagner, who was Liszt's son-in-law. So it's a lecture recital, but mostly a recital. And then I'll be playing it in London at the Liszt Cultural Institute of the Hungarian government in London. And then I'll be playing it in Budapest, Liszt's third hometown, as well in November. But I'm writing a very large novel, which has been in plan now for 2 or 3 years, which will incorporate music of all kinds into the fabric of the narrative. I see them as essentially the same activity, writing and playing the piano. And it just kind of sums up everything I've devoted my life to. And hopefully that'll be the last book I write, Steve. And then I'll retire to my shack in Ireland, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for this, Michael. This has been a fun tour of part of your horizon. and I'll look forward to that next book. And in the meantime, best of luck to Rage to Conquer. And I don't know, I may or may not be around the LA area at one of those appearances, or I'll find an excuse to go to Budapest and hang out with our mutual friend John O'Sullivan.
Oh, absolutely.
Who, opens and closes the town there, right? I mean, it's always fun seeing John and Melissa there.
Well, you'll certainly know where to eat when you go to Budapest.
That's right. I blame John for the fact that I've gotten larger than I was a few years ago.
I know.
Anyway, thank you, Michael. Good luck. See you soon.
You're welcome. Thank you, Steve.
I thought it would be real cool if I picked up my dad's guitar, learned me some Irish tunes, playing for a couple friends at some little Polish bar, a little whiskey in the jar. I never thought it'd go so far. So why you wanna bring me down? Not from Ireland, I'm from Allentown. I learned something from an Irish girl. She came to our second show. But when an Irish girl has something to say, she's gonna let you know. She said she wasn't very fond